So let's get back to Levitsky and Way. The first part is that there will be a few questions. Obviously we'll have questions about Levitsky and Way. They cover a lot of material. We tested a lot of the material. It's only fair to stay focused on the things that we covered. So, right, they group into these three categories we talked about, right? You can have a democratization, you can have an unstable versus stable authoritarian group, right? These are the three paths, the three divergent paths. Don't worry about this. Why I want you to know the difference agency and structure, right? This has been in the essay questions a lot, so it's not really going to be as much in the final exam. We've talked about these international dimensions, right? Diffusion is something we've talked about, how that process works. Direct democracy promotion, yes, after 1992, the United States went out of its way to try and democratize a number of states, very unsuccessfully, right? It has not been nearly as successful as it could have been, right? Because whether it's the tactics or whether you can't use foreign power to democratize, right? Whatever the reasons are, right? Just not as successful as we expect. I'm not going to ask you about transnational advocacy networks. Right? This is a thing that you cover later if you're a political science major. We talked about Western leverage, who is vulnerable, right? Remember that vulnerability has to do with the size and strength of the economy, right? Are you competing, right? Do you have competing Western foreign policy objectives, right? Remember, counterterrorism is more important than democratization, right? The United States will keep an authoritarian government in power if it believes it is better at stopping terrorism, right? This is Egypt under Mubarak, right? This is many of the Middle East and North African states. Why were their authoritarian rulers kept in power and supported by the United States? Because counterterrorism became the more important. And then counter-hegemonic powers, right? China and Russia today, right? China and Russia today are the big hegemonic powers. In the past, it was Japan and France. But today, it is predominantly China and Russia. So how do they work, right? They offer other alternative behaviors that don't engage in democratization. China and Russia do not care if you democratize. They care about having better trade relationships, more influence, right? China has become sort of the competitive power, the most competitive state with the United States, and it has different goals, right? And so it offers an opportunity for states not to be as vulnerable, as influenced because of that. Now, I want you to know these linkages, but I also include this extra credit. Right here's the slide. All of you know where it's at, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time covering it. There are questions about it, but you should know the difference, right? Flows of people versus diffusion versus, right, treaties. They're all listed, right? These are the linkages to the West, right? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over it just because I think we've done that. We've talked about this proximity aspect a lot, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that. If you're closer, the abuses are more obvious. They're seen, right? Mexico is so close that we are connected to it. We recognize electoral fraud more easily because we're paying more attention, as opposed to sub-Saharan Africa and the southern part of Africa, which is often ignored by Western media, right? Unless there's like a kidnapping or something. There isn't a lot of media covering that, but things that happen in Mexico are big news in the United States because of proximity. It's closer, it's a neighbor, right? And so there's more interest in that. I don't want to spend too much. We talked about this a lot, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. The domestic constituencies matter, right? They will influence that. But what we want to get into is the party, the within state domestic factors that matter, because this is going to be a lot of questions. Sorry, we'll get there. Is this organizational power aspect, right? How does organizational power? It is a domestic factor. It fits, there's existing theory about how the opposition works. It allows for this, what we call incumbent strategy, right? How do we set up our incumbent party? And we see that it really has impacted a number of states, right? When we talk about African democratization, Many of them didn't fail or fail to democratize in the way we expect because they had more fractures. It's because they didn't have the services. They weren't providing services. They didn't have the money, right? It couldn't function the way that we normally see a state function. And we'll talk about that fiscal aspect later. But, right, if they can't even function the way we'd expect democracy to work, and they don't have the organization and they don't have elites that are connected, then they're not going to be able to sustain a competitive authoritarian regime or maybe even a democracy, right? You have to have some national identity, some civil society, some connection to each other, and then you have to have this organizational capacity. So there are different types of organization, right? There's the state's coercive capacity, right? That's high intensity, that's where you have these crackdowns, and then you have low intensity coercion, and this is surveillance and harassment, right? These are often unofficial behaviors, right, but that are on the behest or for the incumbent party, right? And so low intensity coercion can be very effective, and it just depends on how it works, right? You have the military and the state organization capacity, and then you have the party, and these are different, so I want you to know the difference between these. When we talk about scope and cohesion, remember it's how far, how many people, right? How can we go? Is it just the capital? Is it the entire state? Is it just their behavior in public, or is it also their behavior in their homes, right? And so the scope is how much is the state able to reach into those aspects of lives and that distance away from the capital, right? Because the further away from the capital, the less power and influence, right? That's why rural areas of states have less government influence than urban areas, just because it's more difficult. And so your scope is how far do you reach and how much depth do you have into people's lives. And then cohesion, how connected are you? Right? Is your military giving just legal orders, or is it giving illegal orders to fire into civilian protesters? Right? Will your military people follow those orders? Right? Will your personnel follow those orders and actually shoot into a defenseless crowd? Right? That depends on the cohesion of the unit. Right? Because if they don't, if you order them to fire and they don't, then that's going to become a huge problem. And there are some clear factors, and the factors are the same in party power, and I want you to know these factors, these cohesive factors, right? There's always fiscal help. If you pay your soldiers, they're more likely to do what they're told. If you stop paying them, we saw this in the Soviet Union and then in Russia, if you stop paying soldiers, they're not going to do their job if they're not getting paid, because then they're going to go get other jobs. They're going to go find ways to make money because they need to eat and provide shelter for their families, for themselves and their families. Do they share an ethnic identity, right? Ethnic cleavages are important, they matter, right? And they have a lot of influence. Is there an ideology? Sometimes a group of people will sacrifice themselves for an ideology, for a revolution, for a national ideal. This is very common, right? The American exceptionalism is this idea that we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, so we don't provide as much services. That's an ideological cohesive factor that causes us to be okay with less services and have to do more for ourselves because it's part of our identity and our national belief system. And then solidarity, right? Nasser is the most obvious example, right? You have this connection to Nasser, that his policies aren't always the grounding force, but the people believe in him, and so it creates solidarity. And remember, solidarity only lasts for a generation. It is the shortest lived, because only the people who were in the fight together really have the solidarity ties. The next generation doesn't have that tie, right? It's also why South Koreans who are older want Americans to stay in South Korea and keep bases in South Korea, because they have that memory of them fighting alongside each other to keep South Korea independent. Whereas the next generation, the younger group, especially the younger group now, only sees the military in the way. It only sees tanks accidentally killing people in the street because they didn't see the pedestrian, right? And so they're like, no, American forces need to get off of the soil, South Korean soil. And so solidarity really only lasts for a generation. And once the people who were involved in that conflict start to die off or retire or remove themselves from public life, the new population doesn't have that same connection. We talk about party strength a lot, mobilizing support, having some youth wing that can handle the low intensity coercion. So a youth wing does a lot of things. The first is low intensity coercion. They can break windows and bust up cars and mess up meetings and do all of that because it doesn't cost them a lot if they get arrested, because they'll get released, right? And the unemployment side, if they don't have a job to go to anyway, so they have time and it's easy to mobilize them. The other factor is that young people can be sort of everywhere. They can be everywhere and sort of be integrated into all these groups. And so the other part about low intensity coercion that parties can really benefit from isn't just necessarily interfering or harassing or threatening, but also just supervising, right? Just being able to observe everything that's happening. And young people can really sort of be in all of these positions, be out in the world, and really catch all of that information. And so every party, not just in competitive authoritarianism, but every party benefits from a youth wing to go out and observe the behavior and be involved in society. And it's just that young people tend to be more involved in society than older people, right? Older people are more secluded, right? They don't go out as much, whereas young people are out talking to a diverse crowd more often, right? Especially as you see, as more people get vaccinated and we move out of this, we're going to want to be outside. But people over 40 are still going to want to be home. They're still going to want to be home more often. And so it's going to be young people out in the streets having conversations about government and policy, and those are where the conversations and interactions are occurring. And if you're a young Republican conservative, you're going to hear a lot of conversations in the Las Vegas area by young liberal Democrats about what they're planning, what they're doing, what they want, and you're going to be able to communicate that to your party about what the young voters want, right? And so that observational power is really strong when it comes to youth wings. Right, a coercive party has some benefits. They're winning elections, controlling the legislature, right? If you win elections, you control elections, it's very connected. And then, of course, right, they solve the successor issue. If you have a really strong party, any of the leaders in that party can take over for the president and still have the party stay in power and not have it defy the will of them or have it arrest the old president, right? The former president. So we've talked about this a lot. I don't want to waste too much time on it. Right, knowing what it means to be a cohesive party, knowing what Levitsky and Way say about it is a number of questions in the exam because we spend a lot of time on it. And it has the most testable material that you can really see the logic behind of it, right? It gives you critical analysis skills in that process. We've already covered scope and cohesion. Remember, it's the same things, right? It's this idea of what do you share, these non-material ties, ethnicity, ideology, and solidarity. And so solidarity only lasts for a generation. Don't worry about coding. We already talked about patronage a lot. I'm not worried about this. This is not something I'm worried about. That's not on the exam. You shouldn't be worried about it. State and party strength combined, right? The ability to highly organize, right? And then this economy of scale, right? You're sort of limiting costs by saying you can cover one with the other, but if you're relying on the party to fulfill the role of the coercive apparatus, it's going to stretch the party thin, right? So if you have two strong factors, right? You have the military or the coercive apparatus and the party, and if one is covering for the other, it has to cover more ground, and if you stretch it too thin, it damages it. And this one is not weak, and this one weakens, and then you have both be weak, right? So while one can cover for the other a little bit, too much coverage can be very problematic. I don't think I'd asked you about that. It is path dependent, right? If you have high organizational power, then the stable authoritarian regime will be there. Otherwise, you have an unstable authoritarian regime, right? The only time you go from a competitive regime to a democracy is when you have a stable regime or a regime that was sort of stable, transition into the rules and values of a democracy, right? If you have an unstable regime, it's just changing who's in charge, but not the uneven playing field that Levitsky might talk about. We do cover a lot of other arguments that explain this behavior, and modernization is the biggest one. So we'll talk about that. And then economic performance. If you are in a recession, things will fall apart. And so that shouldn't be something that's too difficult, but it is something that you should see. If you see on a test, right? If you're in an economic crisis and you can't respond to it, of course you're going to likely change regimes because the current regime can't handle the crisis, right? And so these can happen a lot. But if you have very strong cohesion and you can respond very well, and you have the capacity, the organizational capacity to respond to an economic crisis, then you're likely to be in more power, even if you don't fix everything, but because you can provide some sort of service to the public, and it makes the public want to support that party. We're not going to talk about institutional design because these are about formal rules, and Levitsky and Way say, yeah, there are formal rules that might have an impact, but formal rules don't dictate government behavior in a competitive authoritarian regime anyways. And so, just to finish, it is a structural argument. They're focusing on the post-Cold War era, It's all about linkage and leverage, right? So proximity, how close are you to a Western state? And then how vulnerable are you? What are your economic ties? What are your social ties? How vulnerable, how much leverage does the Western states have over your state? And then how do you balance that out as a domestic factor? Incumbent organizational power. What is the incumbent's ability to maintain power, and how cohesive and organized is the party and the coercive apparatus of that state, right? So that's the Levitsky way. There are a number of questions, which is why I focus on it as much as I do. I think we have 4 more. So now let's talk about electoral systems. Let me add. I really wish it would go in the order that I want it to. Okay. When we talk about electoral systems, right, we want to remember that we are dealing with district size. So the district is just the area in which the people are elected. And so you form a district. And if it's a single-member district, which most of the United States is single-member districts, then only one person can be elected from that district, right? Or if we're talking about senators or something like that, like 2 people for the state, but only one election, only one for each election, right? So even if you have multiple people who get elected to a certain district, if there's only one elected in each election cycle, then it's still a single-member district. We talked about Duverger's law, right? Duverger says if you have a single member district with a single vote, right, then you're likely to get 2 parties, right? And so that is the aspect, right? And so this is part of this first past the post. So FPTP is the acronym. This is a majoritarian system that has to get 50% plus 1. So if there are 100 votes, you need 51 votes to get elected. And it just doesn't really work for a multi-party system because most of the parties won't get elected. You also have a plurality system. So plurality systems are a little easier because you just have to get the most votes. But if you only have 2 parties, the one with the most votes is also the one with 50% plus 1. So plurality systems and majoritarian systems, they don't always act differently if there's only 2 parties. If you get more than 2 parties and you have a plurality system, then it behaves a little differently. But for the most part, if you only have 2 parties, plurality and majoritarian systems are going to behave the same. The other type of voting, and I'm not sharing this, hold on, I apologize. There we go. So the other type of voting is proportional representation. So I didn't have the video, I didn't have the files up for the people in the WebEx. So we talked about district size, Duverger's law, first past the post, right? The next is proportional representation. So the percentage of votes you get is the percentage of seats, right? So if you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats. If you get 25% of the vote, you get 25% of the seats. There are some minimum thresholds in some states, but not in all states. You know, if everyone got a seat, then how would you allocate those seats, right? You need some percentage. If there's only 100 seats, then you need at least 1% of the vote, but maybe we say you need at least 5% of the vote to not have 100 different parties. It's harder to manage 100 different parties. There's also over and under representation. So if you're the biggest winning party, you should get more seats than the less winning party. Usually if you get 45-50% of the vote, you actually get 50 to 55% of the seats. So there is over-representation in some systems, which means that if you're a small party and you get 9% of the vote, you still might only get 5% of the seats because of the organization of those seats. The next part is how do you vote, right? There's sincere voting and strategic voting. And sincere voting is simple. You just vote for the individual or the party that you most like. Strategic voting is more common because you say, okay, I'm going to vote for the one I most like, but they also have to be able to win, right? You might have really liked Kanye West, right? Kanye West was on a number of ballots, but not enough ballots to actually win the election, right? He couldn't win enough states to win the election, right? But you might say, you know what, I really want Kanye West to be president for a whole host of reasons, right? Wherever it is doesn't really matter, right? You can pick whoever you want to be president. But you realize that Kanye West isn't going to win. And so you say, okay, well, Kanye West isn't going to win. who's the next best option of the two winnable options, right? And really, in the last election, only Trump or Biden could have won. Those are really the only two options winners. And in the 2016 election, it was really Trump or Clinton, and right, you had other factions like the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, but they weren't really capable of winning, right? And so then you start doing a strategic vote. You say, okay, how do I make my vote count the most, right? And I only prefer this to the viable alternative. And in America, it's very easy. Like, either I vote for a Republican or for a Democrat. And they're so diametrically opposed, it's very easy to decide, right? If you're like, oh, I'm not sure I want to vote for the Green Party, well, then I should vote for a Democrat, because that's the closest to the Green Party. I'm not sure I'm going to vote for a Libertarian, well, the next closest thing to a Libertarian is actually sort of a Republican. It depends on how you define libertarian, right? But so you have this sort of cohesive movement of voting towards the two parties, and what that does is it avoids a wasted vote, right? You don't vote for someone who has no chance of winning, and therefore your likelihood of winning is highest. Okay. So why vote sincerely, right? You might not care as much about the election outcome, but you might really care about voicing your opinion, right? So voting sincerely is one of those things where you can have a political statement where you say, I want to vote for the person I believe in most, whether or not they win. Voting strategically is based on rational choice, right? And it follows a few assumptions, right? We assume that individuals know who is capable of winning an election and who is not capable of winning an election, right? Anyone who paid enough attention to the Green Party and the 2016 election understood they weren't in enough states and in enough electoral votes, it was not possible for them to win. They would have to win, even if they had gotten every single state they were in, they would still be short of the 270 electoral votes, or they would be just over, but they'd have to win all of these states, which is very unlikely. And on top of that, right, they had not been in all 50 states, which means it would be harder for them to get 270 electoral votes. The next thing is that they can order the parties. In the United States, it's very easy to say, okay, I either am a Democrat or a Republican. In the United Kingdom, if you say, am I the Labour Party, am I a Liberal Democrat, am I a Conservative, am I a Scottish Independence Party, right? Ordering yourself in party becomes more difficult. Germany has the same problem. They have a number of parties. They're sort of organized left to right, but there are parties right next to each other, really, really close in their values, and it's hard to organize yourself in the right party. But we assume that they at least know where their preferences are, and they can sort of order the parties close enough to their preferences. And then they know the parties, right? Some parties aren't as clear, but in most cases, parties in power have clear policy directions. So we talked about strategic voting. One of the ways that we can look at is strategic and sincere voting happening is a runoff. And a runoff election is where you have first a majoritarian system. And if no candidate receives 50% plus one votes, right? So if there are 100, they need 51. If there are 1,000, they need 501, just to, right? 50% plus one more, right? So then they take just the top two candidates and they include just those two. And then it doesn't matter whoever gets the most votes also gets 50% plus one, right? And so they exclude all the candidates. So what you will see in that case, often, even in the United States when this happens, you'll have multiple Republicans or Democrats running for the same party. And then whoever wins top two would end up being a Republican and a Democrat, right? And a runoff's a really good test. Because say there are two Republicans and one Democrat. The Democrat gets, say, 40% of the vote. And then the two Republicans each get about 30% of the vote, right? Now, whoever's leading, right, becomes the favored Republican. And if they got that much percent of the vote, the Republicans are probably going to win a runoff. So it allows the voters to vote first on the Republican that they most like, and then in the second round, vote strategically. Where if they didn't have that second round, they'd have to vote strategically in the first round, right? And that allows, that runoff or that second stage allows for the possibility of more parties. I'm not going to ask you names, right? I don't like this idea of asking you names of individuals. For those of us that are older, right, Ross Perot was he was such social phenomenon, and he was on, right, that there were all these SNL skits, and there was all this comedy and sort of culture around Ross Perot. It was very funny. His interactions were very funny, but if you weren't alive during that time, I don't expect you to know who Ross Perot and Rob Nader are. They're sort of older cases, and I don't expect you to know names. I expect you to know states and laws and sort of the parties, but not the names of individuals. We talked about England, right, the Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrats. There is a question, if we're only talking about strategic voting, about the independence parties. So when I asked the question, a lot of people were like, oh, the Republican Party shouldn't exist because of the voting rules. Well, the Republican Party could exist in a proportional system. It would align with the Conservative Party, but the party you wouldn't expect based on strategic voting or based on the electoral rules is the Scottish Independence Party, right? And so that's the party that you don't expect, but exists because it's not driven by just can we win control of the Senate, but also we care about one issue more than any of the other, and that's the issue that matters to us. And so we're going to defy electoral rules and vote for a party that can't win national representation, that can't really take over the parliament in the UK because of it, right? And so that's an argument that exists. I don't really ask a lot of questions about Israel. It's important information explaining strategic voting, but as far as knowing this case, it's very complex and it's a little beyond what I want in a 200 level course. What matters here is district magnitude, right? You need to know what it is and how it influences voter behavior and party behavior. All right, so. Let's see if this works. I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna go a little out of order just because it's becoming more difficult to. It's slowing. I can feel it slowing down. So we talked about modernization theory and facts. We just talked about this, so I'm only going to spend a few minutes on it, but there are some questions, right? There are questions from exam 3 that are very similar in the final exam. Know that a political regime is the rules about how a state behaves. Know the definitions, what's the difference between you need to know the difference between why is this? Okay, hold on. You need to know the difference between a regime, a state, a government. These all have different meanings, right? What does a state mean? And we covered all of this, but I'm not going to cover it again because we covered it quite a bit. But there are some questions about regimes. This modernization argument, right, it has autonomy, right? You have to have autonomy. So Skocpol and Swirsky and Netto both talk about autonomy and how people need this privacy, this private information, this groups that aren't involved by the government to be able to change their behavior. The next thing is this causal chain, right? Modernization argues and follows this exact causal chain. I've asked you about it before. There are going to be questions on the final exam about it. What is the causal chain for modernization? It's right here. It's slide 3 on this modernization theory and facts PowerPoint. It is not an issue that you should worry about. Sorry, I can't sit down and speak for some reason. It's not an issue that you should worry about as far as like getting the exact order right, but they have different behaviors that matter, right? Education is different from urbanization, right? Industrialization is different from mobilization. So you need to know them and be able to respond to questions about them. A successor moment is discussed, you should know that. Foreign pressure. We've already talked about these as alternative explanations, but they're pretty clear, right? If the leader dies, then obviously that's going to cause some problems about the regime stability. If you're in a recession, you're going to want a new government. You're like, how do we get in this recession? Well, if the incumbents cause this recession, I want new people. This is why recessions often lead to turnover in governments. And then foreign pressure, right? In 2003, the United States changed the government and the regime of Iraq by eliminating Saddam Hussein, and changed the entire regime by saying that they needed to be democratic. And we saw over the last 20 years, right, the last approximately 20 years, right, that we've had all of these problems because foreign pressure can cause a regime to collapse, but building a new regime is very difficult. So they reject foreign pressure, and they sort of argue that modernization is the aspect, right? They talk about dollar amounts. I don't think I asked you about dollar amounts, but remember they're in here. If I do ask you a question, I really hope I don't, but I might say what's the transition point, or right, just make sure that you know you have access to this. If you're not sure, look it up, right? It's an open exam, your notes, and in fact in the final exam you can discuss with each other, right? This is one of the changes, right? Talk with each other, figure out these answers together. Find a way to get the best possible score on the final exam. Get that done, turn in the paper. That's 35% of your grade between the paper and the final exam. And then next week, right, over the course of next week, as you're like, my grade's a B plus and I want an A, how do I fix that? What extra credit haven't I done? What quizzes didn't I get full score on? Can I go back and get a better score on exam 2? Go through all of the steps to make sure that you can do the best possible you can. And then if you've reached all of the extra credit and you're still sort of hoping for a leadership, then email me and talk to me, right? Do all the things that are possible first, and then I will consider sort of an exchange about how you can fix your grade. We talked about democracy and survival, right? The biggest part about this is wealthy democracies survive. If you're wealthy, that doesn't mean you're going to become a democracy, but wealthy democracies survive. There have not been a transition back. If you have enough wealth and you become a democracy, after about 5 years, you're going to stay a democracy, right? And we know that you have to continually reassess democracies. And then the other part is this logic. If you develop a powerful democracy and you're sharing wealth, but in order to become a dictator, you'd have to destroy some of the economic power of your state. Then the math that exists is that 100% of a dictator's pie is actually smaller than 50% of a shared, right? Your 50% of a shared democracy pie. And so one of the things that we see that really supports this logic of modernization is at some point, the elites are better off sharing power under a democracy because the economy grows so much, their share is more than a democracy whole. Right, then sharing is more economically sound. And so it's very strong logic. It doesn't have to acquire altruism or people behaving in good ways or be people following norms of democracy. It's just that you're better off financially supporting democracy, and that's self-reinforcing because then the democracy does better, then the economy does better, right? They pursue goals, right, to improve everyone, and so the elites are able to take more in and they're willing to support that system even more. Modernization talks about economic development through import substitution. We've talked about this. This is the South Korean example, right? You start with factories and specialization, and then you have these low value added goods, and you use these low value added goods to build up a high value added good industry. And then that new infant industry gets protected and supported, and then eventually you hope that it causes economic growth. But in this intermediate stage, when you're trying to transition into an advanced economy, it's risky because what if your new high value added good isn't supported, right? What if you go through all this trouble to have a typewriter industry that's adding a lot of value, but then it's 1991 and computers are taking off, right? And typewriters are no longer going to be a thing. Right? There's these risks involved. The same thing with cars, right? Daewoo was very successful, but Daewoo doesn't really exist in the same capacity anymore because it was bought out, right? It was bought out by another company that moved a lot of its production outside of Korea. So eventually they do very well in other industries. Korea develops in other ways as well. A lot of services and a lot of computer-involved technology. Computer technology was redundant, but, right? The intermediate stage is risky, and then you get to, okay, now we're an economically developed state, and now, right, we can either sustain a democratic regime or we can sustain an autocratic regime. We've reached a level to where people have gotten used to the regime that exists, and people are successful and sort of happy, right? And so even though Maslow says eventually you want political involvement, one of the things that we see is that if you're wealthy enough and you're getting paid enough, you may not want a say in the government as long as you're getting enough from the government in services and payouts. And you're like, no, I'm good in this way. I'm good not having a say as long as my payouts continue. It makes the state vulnerable to economic crisis, but right, as long as they continue to pay out the patronage and clientelistic networks, they don't have to worry about it. The historical context I don't want you to worry about, right? We've already talked about the different areas and the different times and their different impacts, right? Pre-World War II, Cold War, post-Cold War are the three times that we're talking about. We'll probably talk about like a post 9/11 or post-pandemic, but those are not things that are in the exam. And then this concerning conclusion that we had, does a state have to start as an authoritarian government? I would argue no, right, but this is the argument that they're coming up with, and it's a very sound argument. Let's see what this goes to, responsive and responsible. Okay, I like how that works. Okay. So we're going to talk about responsive versus responsible, right? Many of you wrote your question here, right? I answered it, so hopefully there's a lot of clarity. Responsive is you do what the people say. This is being a delegate, right? You're like, I'm going to listen to the people. I'm going to do what the people want. I'm going to focus on short-term demands. And then responsible is I'm going to try and solve issues that exist for the American people or the people that I'm governing, not just American, but right, whoever you're governing, right? If you're from Zimbabwe, Zimbabwean people, right? If you're from Egypt, the Egyptian people, right? These are my people. I'm going to represent them in a way that solves their problems, but I have to be careful because there are political costs, right? Every time you solve a problem that the people don't feel like is a big deal, right? If you look at right now, I know a lot of you didn't watch the president's speech, but he said that part of his infrastructure bill, he wants to get rid of all lead pipes in the United States, right? Now, one of the things that happens to be true about the United States is that a lot of people don't think about lead pipes because they only really exist in Midwestern states. Coastal states long ago replaced much of their lead piping. So there's only a part of the country that this is even an issue for. And it only became an issue because we started having serious health complications from these lead pipes in the last few years. So it's going to be a political cost. The Democratic Party is going to lose votes by paying for a lot of these things, especially in sort of contentious, in competitive Republican states, wherever they're trying to compete in Republican states, like Texas. Texas is having more Democrats move in. It's having a demographic change. It could become more Democrat controlled, but as long as it pursues these issues, they have costs that will cost the entire party. So responsible is difficult. It's difficult to be responsible all the time. Sometimes you have to be responsive to what the people want. We talked about historical development. I'm not worried about that. I'm not worried about this change from sort of less suffrage to universal suffrage and more competition. I do want you to see the parties as an institution, right? They have an order, they have rules, right? Who's in charge, what you have to listen to, right? The American committee system is the most obvious. Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi have an incredible amount of power over government because they're the leaders of the party in the chamber that they're in, right? Mitch McConnell is the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi is the leader of the Democratic Party in the House, right? And so they have a lot of power and influence over that. Now, the concern is that most parties are going to be too responsive. They're going to do what the people want. And because they're going to do what the people want, they're not going to make responsible decisions. They're going to get too into debt. They're going to not handle social services appropriately, right? And this all leads to this sort of Keynes versus Hayek argument, right? What happens when things go poorly? Should the government spend to get us out of a recession, or should it tighten its belt as well, right? And Americans have said, no, we're Keynesians. When things go wrong, the government should spend to get us back on track. But a lot of other places, the argument has been, no, the government should tighten its belt too because everyone should do what everyone else is doing, right? And these are both sound economic arguments, but will parties really do this, or will all parties, because they want to get reelected, be Keynesian? Will all parties throw money at the problem because they want to stay in power, because their goal is to remain elected? We already talked about this Cold War, right? This Cold War era, right? We're not as interested in domestic behavior. We want to promote national identities, right? We want one national identity, just because it's easier to handle a state that has one national identity, shared values. We talked about being part of this first, second, or third world, right? The second being the Soviet, and the third world being the unaligned states. And then we talked about appropriate spheres, right? Should the government and the parties be involved should the government and the parties be involved in your private life, right? Feminists and progressives said, yes, we want you more involved and the private life to protect us, right? Whereas conservatives have said, no, the private is private, parties and political behavior is public, they need to be separate, right? This executive versus legislative, right? Should executives not be partisan, right? As soon as you become president, are you no longer a Democrat? So as long as you become president, are you no longer a Republican? Does it in there because of that universal mandate? You have a mandate to respond to the entire American public, right? Or the entire public of the UK, right? The prime minister is responsible for the entire state, everyone in it, citizens of that state. And then politics and administration, right? Should everyone be confirmed by the Senate? Should political appointees be at every stage of the way? Or are there some offices that you just want filled by scientists and doctors, right? The person who's in charge of the National Institute of Health, should that be a doctor, right? And I don't mean someone who's pursuing a PhD, but someone who has an MD, a medical doctor. Should a medical doctor be in charge of that? And if a medical doctor should be in charge, should be using the merits of their understanding of medicine to put them into that position, right? Where is meritocracy important, and where is Senate confirmation in elections important, right? Because remember, you want the bureaucracy to be capable of solving a problem. You want them to know the information very well, but you also want them to do what you ask. And what we have seen time and time again is if you have bureaucrats and you have these political appointees who are demanding a certain behavior, and the bureaucrats don't think that's the most effective policy, they just don't do it. They avoid doing it, right? And so when you have that behavior, you have to deal with, yes, I want qualified individuals, but I also want them doing what the government tells them to do. And so you're always having this trade-off, this work together of what's the limit of the party? Should the party be involved in every step of the way, or should it say, this is what we want to happen, this larger goal, figure out how to do it? What's the interaction that we want in that section? And then finally, we talked about incentive structures, right? You want to get reelected, so you're going to be a responsive party, so you can win elections. But you also eventually need to solve problems, water treatment, lead pipes, right? There are going to be problems, and if you don't solve them, things are going to get much worse, right? Prevention is easier than repair, right? So all of these things happen, and the solution that a lot of places have come up with is jargon. I'm going to use these words to make sure that I sort of obfuscate or make it unclear what I'm doing so I don't pay the same political costs. And then the last part we're going to talk about is, the last slides we're going to cover, I'm going to cover a few more things, but I want to make sure there's slides here, is extractive capacity, right? Extractive capacity is pretty clear. So a regime is the rules and institutions, right? We cover this as Chia above, right? But when we're talking about extractive capacity, we're really going to talk about two things: taxation, and rents, right? Am I taxing the public, or am I selling resources for rents, right? And so how do we connect regime type to extractive capacity? We've looked at some of these behaviors where certain groups can work very effectively, right? That if you're a dictator, you can say, we're going to build up our economy and no one can fight with you. If you're a democracy, you have to pay all these upfront costs, right? The regime can really matter, but for us, there aren't going to be as many questions about the regime. What there are going to be about the arguments here, right? How do they work, right? What are the arguments about which group being better at different aspects? And one of the things is that we've talked about is this idea of an authoritarian modernizer, right? Authoritarians might be better at developing an economy when it's not developed. An underdeveloped economy might be better off under a authoritarian leader because they can force roads and bridges to be built. They can force, right, in manufacturing to occur and behavior, right? If you look at South Korea, it's the same extent. Reza Shah is in Iran, sort of modernizes that state by forcing the building of roads and bridges and industry. South Korea suppresses the labor of textiles to build up its infant industry, right? So authoritarian modernizers might be helpful, right? They may not, right? But there is that argument that we've talked about. Authoritarian rulers might also be able to curtail consumption. We're not going to let you buy as much of a certain product. We actually saw this last year, right? This has actually happened in democracies, but it happened by the corporations, not by the government, right? Not by the regime, right? Where there's limits on how much of certain things you can buy, right? That became part of that consumption limitation. One of the things that is notable is that the United States government, the regime that existed, never put a curtail on how much toilet paper or hand sanitizer. It never really stopped that. The corporations started responding to make sure that they could provide it to all their customers, right? This wasn't a regime response, because democracies aren't really great at stopping consumption. Democracies often promote consumption. They say, buy, buy, buy. Don't say, go out and spend your money, because that grows the economy. That's a capitalist approach, right? But authoritarian might say, we need to have this. We need you to not buy this as much. So there are some regime arguments about each group being better at extracting capacity. On the democracy side, if you are a democracy and people believe that their tax dollars are going to services that are important, they might be more willing to pay their taxes, right? They might not evade taxes or find loopholes. They might say, yep, you're providing good services with your taxpayer dollars. I know if I try and cheat on my taxes, I'll have to pay some sort of cost, and therefore I'm going to just pay my taxes, right? And that makes you better at forming an extractive capacity, because you don't have to go through all of these audits, right? You don't have to go through this entire process. And remember, both of these problems are frequency dependent, right? If 3 people out of 30 million are doing something, it's not a problem. If 10%, 3 million, 5 million people are doing it, then it becomes a problem, right? The government is not worried about isolated incidents, right? Why it's sort of a trigger, right? When we talk about violence in any state, right? Shootings or protests, right? Revolts or, whatever it is, if it happens once in a year, that's an isolated incident, right? We're not going to worry about, right? The Texas weather pattern and their network not being able to handle it, it happens about every 10 to 20 years. So Texas isn't responding at the same level. If it's a systemic issue like shootings in the United States that are occurring over and over again, then that's an issue that's frequency is high enough that the government is trying to find some sort of response, right? Regardless if they make an effective response, right? It is a systemic issue. Its frequency is too active, right? All right, so this is going to be the last part we talk about. Is a little detailed. I know there's more in this, but the last part that I want to talk about is these 4 things that impact the level of taxation. Let me make sure this is actually on. The first is transaction costs, right? So the way that transaction costs work, that is not a helpful slide, is I want to tax imports. But if I want to tax imports, I need a customs agent. I need someone at the border who's going to catch what goods are coming in and out of. I need there to be some sort of penalty, which means I need a court system that handles penalties, that handles when people violate the customs, who don't pay taxes, who try and evade. I need some sort of experts, bureaucratic experts on how shipping works, how exports work, whether or not we should have tariffs, whether tariffs would be beneficial or not. All of these costs exist. So transaction costs in every encounter, right? It could be the smallest thing. It could be the amount of paper and ink it costs to print the forms that people have to sign when they come in through customs, right? It could be a whole host of things, right? Transaction costs are the amount of money it costs to collect the revenue, right? And so this can really matter. If you don't have a voluntary taxation, right? If you don't have quasi-voluntary taxation, right? Where people come in and pay their taxes. If you had to go and get that taxes all the time, it would cost you money, right? Now, most of us are younger or don't make as much money that we actually get a refund, but we pay taxes in every paycheck. And we don't try to avoid that. You just claim single, you pay taxes all year, you get a refund, right? That is compliance because we're paying the taxes and the government doesn't have to come after us, right? So that decreases the transaction costs. The next is the discount rate. Now, discount rate, the thing about a discount rate is I can only really explain it in examples, but what it means is that you value today more than you value the future, right? How much more is the discount rate? The discount rate is how much you discount the future. So if I offered you $20 a day, right, we've talked about this before, and you're like, $20 a day, great. And I'm like, oh, in a year I could give you 100. Well, and $20 today might feed you today, right? You may not be able to wait it, but you might also say, what is that $100 going to be worth in a year? Am I going to be around in a year? What's the guaranteed payment, right? And rationally, you might say, am I likely to get that $100 or should I just take the 20 now to get the guaranteed $20, right? This is the same thing with like gambling. Should I go gamble or should I keep my money, right? There's a discount feature. Yes, I might win, right? But that probability is low, right? And the discount rate is not that different, right? So what's the value of $100 a year from now to you is a discount rate. And governments often have high discount rates. I'm not worried about 20, right? If you look at, I'll use the American example. If you look at 2025, the Biden administration, the current Biden administration, is not worried about 2025 because it's after an election. It's worried about today until November of 2024. That's the concern, right? That's the concern because the time, the horizon they have is the next election cycle. And so whatever they're trying to get done has to happen that election cycle. So Biden didn't say, oh, hey, we in the next 20 years are going to tackle cancer, right? And cancer is this big thing because he said, right, that we have the ability to cure it as we know it, right? To get rid of it. And I mean, that's a big promise, right? That historically, this is something that has happened, right? How do governments approach disease and things like that? When we see that promise, he's saying before November 2024, there is going to be some advancement in that field. And if there's not, he's going to get punished for it, right? And that's that discount rate. He says, I need this to happen in the next 4 years. The same thing with these bills, right? They have to be passed now, right? And so the discount rate is very high right now for Democrats because in 2022, they might lose the Senate, they might lose the House, right? And so they have really short time. So it doesn't matter what you can give them in 2023. It only matters now. And the people who have voted for them say, you need to do this now. I don't care about 2035 or emission rates or payments or what are you doing right now? And so discount rate is that. How much do you consider the future and how much do you consider that future earnings versus the value of current earnings, right? And if you have a high discount rate, you want higher taxes now and not sort of savings for the future. You want consumption now and not savings for the future, and that can be problematic. And the next is bargaining power, right? So bargaining power is just, can you negotiate between a citizen and the state? And if you look at Greece specifically, one of the things is that there was no leverage that the state had over its citizens to get them to pay their taxes. And so this became a huge problem, that if Greece was collecting 100% of the taxes it was owed by its citizens, it wouldn't have been in such a financial disaster that it was during the European debt crisis. Right, it was in debt. It wasn't growing economically as hard it was, but also it wasn't collecting taxes because its citizens realized that its enforcement mechanism wasn't strong enough to actually punish them for not paying taxes. And so you had a low taxation, you had a low response rate. People weren't paying their taxes, and so it caused them more of a problem, and that bargaining power didn't exist. Or if you look at the United States IRS, if you look at the United Kingdom's tax system, right, if you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail or you get caught, right? That evading taxes is something that people are very serious about. Records are very clear. And so bargaining power when it comes to taxation is very clear in some states because they have the belief that they will get caught. But if enough people weren't paying taxes or were trying to cheat their taxes, right, they would miss some things, right? And in fact, the IRS's budget has been declining, and they have said that for every increase of $1 that you invest in the IRS, you get $6 back because that's another dollar that can be spent investigating a case where someone didn't pay their taxes, right? So the IRS has said we've been defunded enough that we're not collecting the full taxes because we can't look at enough cases to be sure about the tax rate and making sure everyone's paying the right amount. And then fiscal requirements. And fiscal requirements is going to lead us into the very last thing that we're going to talk about. And I do want to finish because my voice is going and I want to give you a chance to sort of ask me questions or email me over the next week to get answers about certain things. Fiscal requirements is how much money you need each month, each week, each year to pay for the running of your state. Now the first is debt, right? Debt occurs when you have an imbalance of trade, when you spend more than you take in, right? But once you have debt, you have to continue to pay on that debt. And the other part is uncontrollable expenditures. If you have 1,000 employees, those 1,000 employees have to get paid every 2 weeks or every month, right? And that's going to continue to occur. So if you're a state and you have to continue to pay your people and you're not taking in revenue, you're just going to get more and more into debt until you run into a very serious problem. a balance of payments problem, right? So fiscal requirements are a huge part of taxation, because if you have a high need, right, if you need a lot of money to pay for what you're providing in services, then you're going to increase the tax rate. And you're going to get better at collecting taxes out of necessity, right? You're like, we can't go into more debt, and I need to be able to raise enough money to pay for what I'm already doing. I need to make more, and taxation has to be the answer to that. Now, there might also be rents, right? When we talk about taxation, right, rents can come into this a bit, but taxation really is a larger base, right? You're going to make more money off taxation than you are rents. One of the things about rents that's very problematic is, yes, you're getting a little bit from it, but taxation of the entire population will always be higher. And so taxation becomes this model about how do we produce the most money that can be provided for government services, and finding the right tax percentage, so that the amount of taxes that we take in cover the services and nothing more, right? You're always trying to tax at the exact right amount, right? I need 35% taxation to cover every service that I'm already providing, right? And so my tax rate should be 35%, not 36%, not 34%, 35%, right? And trying to find that one thing, because if you have extra money, that should go back to the citizens, right? And so most states operate under that belief, right? We want just enough money. Now, if you're a kleptocracy, you bring in a lot of wealth and you keep it. And if you're a democracy, a lot of times your tax rate is a little lower because you want to get elected, and so you're just continually increasing the debt that you have, right? It's very sound electoral politics to lower taxes, but it's going to eventually cost you in fiscal requirements. And at some point, as you get heavily indebted, right, then you can't provide public goods, right, and then, right, you won't have the resources, right? When you stop having public goods, you stop providing for those elites, then the elites will fracture, and that can lead to a social revolution, right? Elections and administrative changes, regime change, these things also impact taxation, because you might not be able to put those tax dollars to services because you're worried about whether or not you're getting elected, whether or not your administration can collect those taxes, and then that always matters when we talked about dependency theory. Now, there is a question or two about dependency theory. I just covered it, I think, last week, so I'm not going to go back over it today, but, right, in each of these things, I want you to understand the basic question. I want you to bring up the exam in 60 questions, take as much time as you need to find the right answers to get the best score you can. Once you've done that, it's all multiple choice. You're going to get a response on that. That's going to get graded right away. Make sure that everything in your grade book matches what you believe it should be. And then if there's an issue, right, make sure that you do all the extra credit. And if you've done all the assignments and then you've done all the extra credit and you're still at this cusp of a grade, you're like a B+ and you want an A-, then we can negotiate about something else you could do. But for now, the biggest part is just to get all of those things done. I think I still need like 20 papers, right? They're due today, so 20 papers. If you don't do the paper and you haven't taken all the exams and done all the quizzes, then there isn't going to be any additional opportunity. So take that into account. I have really struggled with this format, but I really appreciate that you guys are coming in. I see in your work that you're trying. I know this was a difficult semester. You will not hear from me again unless you email me. So I really appreciate what you guys have done. And if you need anything in the next week, email me, and I will do my very best to find you an answer or some way to help you. All right. So thank you. That is actually it for the semester, and I wish you all very good luck.